The first load of timber arrived at 10,847 feet on September 3rd, 1879, and by noon, the men who had hauled it up the switchback trail were already questioning whether the woman who paid them had lost her mind. Margareta Brenner stood at the edge of a shallow depression carved into the eastern slope of Mount Engelmann, pointing at stakes she had driven into the rocky soil, explaining in her accented English that she wanted the foundation dug not outward but inward, into the mountain itself. The teamsters exchanged glances. One of them, a man named Colton Peters, who had been running supplies to the mining camps above Georgetown for 6 years, finally asked the question they were all thinking. "You want us to bury your house before you build it?" She did not smile. She did not explain. She simply paid them an extra $2 each to begin excavating according to her marks, and by the time the sun dropped behind the Continental Divide that evening, they had carved a rectangular pit 7 feet deep into the decomposed granite of the mountainside. The pit measured 32 feet long and 18 feet wide, and it faced northeast, away from the high couloirs that scarred the peak above. Peters would later tell anyone who asked that he had helped a crazy Swiss widow dig her own grave at 11,000 feet. He was wrong about almost everything except her nationality. Margareth Brenner had arrived in Clear Creek County 3 months earlier, in June of 1879, carrying a leather case containing her late husband's papers, $47 in American currency, and a surveyor's notebook filled with drawings her father had made 40 years before in Canton Valais, Switzerland. Her husband Friedrich had died in a tunnel collapse at the Centennial Mine in April, leaving her with a small life insurance settlement and a homestead claim he had filed the previous autumn on a parcel of high mountain land that no one else wanted. The claim encompassed 160 acres of steep terrain at the headwaters of Fall River, more than 1,000 feet above the last of the established mining camps. When Margaret rode up to inspect the property in late June, the snow had only recently melted from the north-facing slopes, and she could see immediately why other settlers had passed it by. The terrain was severe, the winters would be brutal, and directly above the most buildable portion of the claim, a series of steep chutes descended from the summit ridge, the kind of terrain her father had taught her to read before she was old enough to carry firewood. Avalanche paths. She had grown up beneath them. She had lost an uncle and 2 cousins to them, and she understood, in a way that no one in this Colorado mining district seemed to comprehend, that building in avalanche terrain was not a matter of hoping for good luck. It was a matter of geometry. The local settlers had opinions. Thomas Ridley, who ran a small sawmill 4 miles down the valley and had been in the high country since 1871, rode up to inspect her progress in mid-September. He was 53 years old, weathered by altitude and isolation, and he considered himself something of an authority on mountain construction. He stood at the edge of her excavation, looked at the stakes marking where her walls would rise, and shook his head slowly. "You are building a cellar, not a cabin," he said, "and you are building it in the wrong place." He pointed down the slope toward a flat bench 300 feet below, where a cluster of aspens marked a natural clearing. That is where a sensible person builds. Better drainage, less snow load, easier access. Margaret listened politely. She had been listening to this kind of advice since she announced her intention to improve the claim. Every man in the district had a theory about where she should build and how she should build it, and not one of them had ever seen an avalanche bury a village. She thanked Ridley for his concern and asked if he could deliver 1,200 board feet of 2-inch planking by the end of the month. He could. He charged her $8 per 1,000 feet, plus $1 per 100 feet for the hauling, and when he returned with the first load, he found her setting the anchor bolts for a structure that made no sense to him whatsoever. The foundation rose from the excavated pit in a pattern Ridley had never encountered in 30 years of frontier construction. The rear wall, the wall that faced directly into the mountainside, was not a wall at all. It was the mountain itself, the exposed granite face sealed with pine pitch and lined with a double layer of hewn logs set horizontally into carved notches. The side walls were conventional enough, built of notched logs in the standard dovetail pattern, but they were sunk 3 feet into the excavation rather than resting on surface footings. And the front wall, the only wall that would be fully exposed to the elements, was set at an angle, not perpendicular to the side walls, but canted inward at roughly 12 degrees so that the cabin was slightly narrower at the front than at the rear. The roof, when she began framing it in early October, was even stranger. It sloped not simply front to back, as a sensible shed roof would, but upward from front to back at a steep pitch, the rear edge meeting the top of the granite face at an elevation nearly 8 feet higher than the front eave. The result, when viewed from below, was a structure that appeared to be emerging from the mountainside rather than sitting upon it. A wedge of logs and timber driven into the slope like an axe blade set to split kindling. Ridley stood in the October wind and examined the framing with undisguised confusion. "You have built it backwards," he said. "Your roof sheds snow toward the mountain, not away from it. Where does the melt go?" Margaret pointed to a channel she had cut into the granite behind the cabin, a drainage trench lined with flat stones that diverted water around the structure's flanks and down the slope. "The mountain takes the water," she said. "The mountain takes everything. The roof simply tells the mountain where to go." By the end of October, the basic structure was complete, and Margaret Brenner had spent nearly every dollar of her insurance settlement on materials, labor, and supplies to see her through the winter. The cabin measured 28 feet at its widest point, narrowing to 22 feet at the front wall, with an interior ceiling height that ranged from 7 feet at the entrance to nearly 12 feet at the rear, where the peak of the roof met the granite face. She had installed a cast iron stove against the rock wall at the back, reasoning that the stone would absorb heat during the day and radiate it through the night, a technique her father had used in the mountain huts of the Valley, where shepherds survived January nights at 9,000 feet without burning through their entire winter's fuel by Christmas. The windows were small and deeply recessed, positioned to catch morning light, but protected from direct wind by the overhanging eaves. And on the uphill side of the cabin, rising from the granite face like the prow of a ship, she had constructed something that drew the most pointed criticism of all: a reinforced timber structure, triangular in cross-section, that extended 12 feet up the slope above the roofline. It was built of 6-inch logs, cross-braced with iron straps she had salvaged from a collapsed stamp mill and filled with compacted earth and stone. It rose to a point like the bow of a vessel, the apex facing directly uphill toward the couloirs above. When Ridley saw it, he laughed out loud for the first time since his wife had died in 1874. "You have built a plow," he said, "a plow for snow that will never reach you. The avalanches run through Anderson Gulch, 2 ridges over. They have never come through here." Margaret did not argue. She simply continued filling the structure with stone, tamping each layer until the mass was solid enough to deflect the weight of a collapsing mine tunnel. The mathematics were simple, even if no one else could see them. An avalanche in motion carries momentum proportional to its mass and velocity. A vertical wall absorbs that momentum, a wedge deflects it, and the difference between absorption and deflection in her father's calculations was the difference between a buried cabin and a surviving one. The first snow fell on October 29th, 4 inches of wet powder that melted within 2 days. The second snow came on November 11th, 8 inches that stayed. By Thanksgiving, which Margaret observed alone with a meal of salt pork and dried apples, the snowpack at her elevation had reached 31 inches and showed no sign of retreating. She had laid in supplies for 6 months, 200 pounds of flour, 80 pounds of beans, 40 pounds of salt pork, coffee, sugar, dried fruit, and a barrel of sauerkraut. She had fermented herself in September, knowing that scurvy was as much a threat as cold at altitude. Her firewood was stacked in a covered lean-to on the downhill side of the cabin, protected from wind and snow load by an extension of the main roof that created a sheltered corridor along the front wall. She could access her entire winter's fuel supply without stepping more than 4 feet from her door, and the corridor itself was designed to remain clear of drifting snow due to its orientation relative to the prevailing winds. These were not innovations. These were techniques her grandmother had understood in a village above Zermatt, passed down through generations of people who had learned to survive in terrain that punished carelessness with death, but to the settlers in Clear Creek County who had arrived from Illinois and Ohio and Missouri, who had built their cabins the way their fathers had built cabins in timbered lowlands where the greatest winter threat was a frozen pump, her methods looked like madness dressed up as architecture. If you find this kind of forgotten wisdom worth preserving, the practical knowledge that allowed ordinary people to survive extraordinary conditions, I would ask you to consider subscribing to this channel. These are not stories of famous inventors or celebrated pioneers. These are the stories of people whose innovations became so commonplace that we forgot anyone had to invent them at all. A subscription ensures that we can continue researching and sharing this kind of history. But whether you subscribe or not, the story of Margareta Brenner deserves to be heard, because what happened next would prove that her strange construction methods were not the product of grief or confusion or foreign eccentricity. They were the product of a woman who understood exactly what kind of mountain she was living on. The winter of 1879 to 1880 began with unusual mildness. December brought moderate snowfall and temperatures that rarely dropped below zero, and several miners in the district remarked that perhaps the territory was experiencing a warming trend that would make high-altitude settlement more practical than previously assumed. Thomas Ridley, who checked on Margaret twice during December out of what he described as neighborly concern, but what others suspected was skepticism dressed as kindness, reported that she seemed comfortable enough in her strange, half-buried cabin, and that the interior was surprisingly warm for a structure with so few windows. The heat from her stove, he noticed, did seem to radiate from the rock wall in a way that kept the cabin comfortable long after the fire had died to coals. But he remained unconvinced that her location made any sense. "You are 1,000 feet higher than anyone needs to be," he told her during his second visit. "When the real cold comes, you will wish you had listened." Margaret offered him coffee and did not respond. The real cold, in her experience, was not something that arrived on a schedule convenient for those who wished to avoid it. The real cold came when it came, and the only question was whether you had prepared for it or merely hoped it would stay away. January arrived with a temperature drop that made December seem like autumn. On January 4th, the thermometer outside Margaret's cabin read 23 degrees below zero at dawn, and it did not rise above zero for the next 11 days. The snow fell in waves, 6 inches on January 7th, 14 inches on January 12th, another 9 inches on January 16th, building a snowpack that pressed against her cabin walls and buried the lower portions of her windows in drifted white. But the interior remained habitable. The granite wall at her back, which had absorbed the stove's heat throughout December, now released that stored warmth in a steady radiation that supplemented her burning wood. The design, which Ridley had called backwards, proved itself in the mathematics of thermal mass. The rock face stayed between 45 and 50 degrees, regardless of exterior temperature, and the sloping roof shed its snow load efficiently onto the upper slope, where it compacted against the timber wedge and added to the structure's insulating mass rather than threatening its integrity. By January 20th, Margaret was burning less than half the firewood she had budgeted for deep winter, and her lean-to corridor remained clear enough to access her full supply without excavation. The cabin that had looked like a grave was functioning exactly as designed. A thermal envelope nested into the mountain itself, drawing stability from the very terrain that others had considered hostile. Meanwhile, lower on the mountain, the miners and settlers of the Fall River district were struggling. The cabins at 8,000 and 9,000 feet had been built in the traditional manner, log structures set on stone footings, roofs pitched to shed snow away from the walls, doors facing whichever direction seemed convenient at the time of construction. These cabins creaked and groaned under the weight of accumulated snow. Their roofs, designed for the moderate winters of lower elevations, began to sag under loads they were never meant to bear, and the firewood, stacked in exposed piles or inadequate sheds, became buried under drifts that required hours of excavation to access. By late January, 2 families in the Upper Valley had abandoned their claims entirely, retreating to Georgetown until spring. 3 miners at the Centennial Camp were treating frostbite that would cost 2 of them fingers by February, and Marcus Eberly, a 41-year-old former blacksmith from Pennsylvania who had built his cabin on the flat bench that Ridley had recommended to Margaret, was burning furniture to stay warm after a collapsed shed buried his winter's wood supply under 9 feet of compacted snow. None of them knew yet that the worst was still coming. The storm that would define the winter of 1879 to 1880 in Clear Creek County began on February 2nd and did not fully relent until February 9th. Later, meteorological reconstructions, based on reports from Denver and the mountain weather stations that had recently been established by the Army Signal Corps, would estimate that the storm deposited between 6 and 8 feet of new snow at elevations above 10,000 feet, with sustained winds exceeding 40 miles per hour for multiple periods during the event. At Margaret's cabin, she recorded snowfall observations in her surveyor's notebook using a marked stick she had planted at a consistent location each morning. 14 inches by the evening of February 2nd, another 22 inches by the morning of February 4th, 18 more inches by February 5th. By February 6th, she stopped measuring because the wind had created drifts so variable that point measurements were meaningless. What she recorded instead was the sound, a continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voice of a mountain being reshaped by forces that made human habitation seem not just precarious, but absurd. She burned her stove continuously for the first time since arriving on the claim. The temperature outside, when she could force her door open far enough to read her thermometer, hovered between 15 and 25 below zero throughout the storm. Inside, the granite wall maintained its 50-degree stability, and the cabin temperature never dropped below 42 degrees. She rationed her food not out of necessity, but out of caution, unsure how long the storm would continue or what conditions she would face when it ended. And on the night of February 7th, at approximately 2:40 in the morning by her estimation, she heard something that she had not heard since leaving Switzerland, a sound that began as a distant rumble and grew into a freight train thunder that shook the log walls of her cabin and did not stop for nearly 30 seconds. The avalanche that descended through the couloir directly above Margaret Brenner's cabin on the night of February 7th, 1880, would later be estimated at approximately 800,000 cubic feet of snow, ice, and debris, traveling at a velocity between 60 and 80 miles per hour when it reached the elevation of her homestead. It followed a path that no avalanche had followed in living memory, not because the terrain was incapable of producing such an event, but because no storm in living memory had deposited enough snow at exactly the right angle and temperature to trigger a release of that magnitude. The settlers below, the ones who had told Margaret that avalanches ran through Anderson Gulch, were not wrong about historical patterns. They were wrong about the assumption that historical patterns represented the full range of possibilities. The mountain did not care about patterns, the mountain cared about physics. And on February 7th, 1880, the physics dictated that 800,000 cubic feet of snow would descend directly toward the spot where a Swiss widow had built her strange wedge-shaped cabin into the granite face of a slope that everyone had told her was safe. Margaret heard the roar approaching and understood immediately what it meant. There was no time to flee, no shelter to seek beyond the one she had already built. She moved to the back of the cabin, pressing herself against the granite wall that had stored her stove's heat all winter, and she waited. The sound grew until it was not a sound anymore, but a physical presence, a vibration that entered her body through the floor and the walls and the air itself. The cabin shuddered. She heard timber cracking somewhere above her, the sound of her deflection wedge taking the impact it had been designed to take. Snow forced itself through gaps in the front wall, filling the lower portion of the cabin with a powder that glittered in the lantern light like flour thrown from a burst sack. The front door, which opened inward, bulged under pressure and then held, the frame groaning but intact. The windows, small and deeply recessed, cracked but did not shatter. And then, after what felt like hours but was probably no more than 30 seconds, the roar diminished to a rumble, and the rumble diminished to silence, and Margaret Brenner found herself alive in a cabin that was now buried under an estimated 14 feet of avalanche debris on 3 sides. She did not panic. Panic, her father had taught her, was a luxury for people who had other options. She had no other options. She had only the situation in front of her and the resources she had prepared. The stove was still drawing properly, which meant the chimney had not been destroyed, a critical detail since carbon monoxide poisoning killed as many avalanche survivors as the initial impact. The cabin walls had held, which meant the log construction and the earth-bermed design had absorbed the lateral force without collapsing. And the deflection wedge, though she could not see it from inside, had clearly done something, because the cabin should not have survived a direct hit from an avalanche of that size without some mechanism to redirect the flow. She checked her water supply, her food stores, her firewood, all intact, all accessible, all sufficient for weeks if necessary. Then she did the only thing that made sense. She rebuilt her fire, made herself a cup of coffee, and waited for morning. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the packed snow that now covered every window. The interior of the cabin, even in daylight, was dim as twilight, illuminated only by the glow of her lanterns and the red pulse of the stove. Margaret spent the first hours after sunrise assessing damage and planning her excavation. The front door was impassable, blocked by compacted debris that would require tools and time to remove. But she had anticipated this possibility. On the interior side of the front wall, concealed behind a wooden panel, was a secondary exit, a narrow shaft she had dug during construction, angling upward through the log wall and emerging beneath the overhang of her firewood lean-to. The shaft was 18 inches wide and 6 feet long, lined with planks to prevent collapse, and it had seemed like paranoid over-engineering when she built it. Now it represented her only route to the outside world. She removed the panel, lit a candle, and began crawling upward through the darkness toward whatever remained of the surface. The lean-to had survived. The overhanging roof extension, which had protected her firewood corridor all winter, had also protected the exit shaft from the main flow of the avalanche. The debris field had passed over and around the structure, burying the cabin proper, but leaving a pocket of relatively clear space along the front wall where the roof overhang had created an air gap. Margaret emerged into a landscape transformed. Where her cabin had been visible as a wedge-shaped structure protruding from the mountainside, there was now only a smooth expanse of white, broken by the tip of her chimney and the corner of the lean-to roof. The deflection wedge was gone, not destroyed, but buried so completely that no trace of it remained above the surface. It had done its job. It had split the flow, directing the main mass of the avalanche around the cabin on both sides, rather than allowing it to impact the structure directly. The physics had worked. The mathematics had been correct. And Margaret Brenner, standing in the bitter cold of a February morning at nearly 11,000 feet, was the only person in Clear Creek County who was not surprised by her own survival. The news of the avalanche reached the lower settlements by February 10th, when a group of miners from the Centennial Camp attempted to push through the fresh snow to check on isolated homesteads. They found Marcus Eberly's cabin first, the one built on the flat bench that Thomas Ridley had recommended, and what they found there would be discussed in the district for decades. The avalanche had not struck Eberly's cabin directly, but the debris field, spreading as it decelerated across the lower slopes, had deposited enough material against his walls to collapse the roof structure that had already been weakened by the storm's accumulation. Eberly had apparently tried to escape when he heard the collapse beginning. His body was found 12 feet from his front door, partially buried in debris, frozen solid. He had survived the initial collapse. He had not survived the cold. The temperature on the night of February 7th, at his elevation of 9,400 feet, had been approximately 18 degrees below zero. Without shelter, without fire, survival was measured in hours, not days. Marcus Eberly had lasted approximately 6 hours, based on the position of his body and the pattern of the snow that had drifted over him. He had died within a mile of Margaret Brenner's cabin, while she sat drinking coffee in a structure that everyone had told her was foolishly designed. This is the kind of history that rarely makes it into the official records. The story of someone who was right when everyone around her was wrong, and whose vindication came at a cost no one would have chosen. If these stories matter to you, if you believe that practical wisdom deserves to be preserved alongside the more celebrated achievements of famous figures, I would ask you to consider supporting this work. A like, a comment, a share. These simple actions help ensure that stories like Margaret Brenner's reach the people who need to hear them. The algorithms favor engagement, and engagement determines which histories get told and which disappear. But regardless of what you choose to do, the story continues, because what happened after the avalanche matters as much as the event itself. The miners who found Eberly's body reached Margaret's cabin on February 11th, expecting to recover another corpse. Instead, they found a plume of smoke rising from a chimney tip that barely protruded above the debris field, and when they began excavating toward the source, they heard a voice from below, accented, calm, slightly annoyed, asking them to please not step on her roof. It took 4 men the better part of a day to clear a path to her front door, and when they finally pushed the last of the compacted snow aside and the door swung open, they found Margareta Brenner standing in a cabin that was warmer than any structure in the district, with a pot of coffee on the stove and a surveyor's notebook filled with observations about the avalanche's behavior as it passed over her deflection wedge. She had not been idle during her burial. She had been recording data. Thomas Ridley arrived the following day, having heard reports that seemed too improbable to believe. He stood at the edge of the excavated pit that now surrounded Margaret's cabin and stared at the structure for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. The logs were intact. The roof had held. The granite wall at the rear, visible now where the miners had cleared debris from the upper slope, showed no sign of damage. And the deflection wedge, or what remained of it, could be traced by the pattern of the debris field, which curved around both sides of the cabin in a shape that made the physics unmistakable. The wedge had worked exactly as designed. It had split the avalanche like a ship's bow, splitting water, directing the main force around the cabin rather than into it. The mass that had struck the structure directly had been reduced to a fraction of the total flow, and the earth-bermed walls had absorbed that reduced force without failing. Ridley was not a man given to admissions of error. He had built his reputation on being right about mountain conditions when others were wrong. But standing at the edge of that pit, looking at a cabin that should have been crushed and a woman who should have been dead, he could not maintain the pretense. "I told you, this was the wrong place," he said finally. "I was mistaken." Margaret nodded once, without triumph and without vindication. She had not built her cabin to prove anyone wrong. She had built it to survive. The rest of that winter passed without further incident, though the snowpack remained at record levels until late April. Margaret's cabin, once excavated, became something of a local curiosity. Miners and settlers from as far as Idaho Springs made the difficult trek to her homestead to see the structure that had survived a direct avalanche strike. Most of them left confused, unable to articulate what exactly made the design different from ordinary cabins, or why the differences had mattered. The bermed construction, the angled walls, the deflection wedge, the thermal mass of the granite backing, these were not elements they had vocabulary to describe because they had never needed to think about such things. Avalanches were acts of God, unpredictable and unsurvivable. The idea that you could engineer against them, that you could position and orient and reinforce your way to safety, seemed almost like cheating. Margaret did not explain. She simply showed them her father's notebook, with its faded drawings of mountain huts in the valley, its calculations of force vectors and deflection angles, its accumulated wisdom of centuries of alpine survival. "This is not new," she told those who asked. "This is very old. I only remembered what others had forgotten." The summer of 1880 brought changes to the Fall River district. 3 families who had abandoned their claims during the winter's worst storms returned to find their cabins collapsed or heavily damaged, and all 3 chose to rebuild higher on the slopes, in locations that offered natural protection from avalanche paths, behind ridges, in the lee of rock outcrops, away from the obvious chutes that fed debris into the valley below. 2 of them consulted with Margaret before beginning construction, asking her to review their chosen sites and suggest modifications to their building plans. She did not charge for this advice. She simply walked their claims with them, pointed out the features they should avoid and the features they should exploit, and showed them how to read the terrain the way her father had taught her to read it. "The mathematics are simple," she told them. "The mountain tells you where it wants to flow. You build where the mountain does not want to go." By 1882, the pattern had become established enough that new arrivals in the district would specifically seek out Margaret Brenner for advice on homestead placement. Her reputation was not that of an architect or an engineer, but of something more specific and more valuable, a woman who understood mountains. She never claimed expertise beyond her own experience. She never suggested that her methods were the only methods or that her survival had been guaranteed rather than probable. But she had survived an event that had killed Marcus Eberly and destroyed 4 other cabins in the district, and that survival counted as evidence in a way that no amount of argument could have achieved. The frontier did not care about credentials or theories. The frontier cared about outcomes. And Margareta Brenner's outcome had been survival when others had died, warmth when others had frozen, shelter when others had been buried. That was all the credential she needed. The cabin she built into the mountainside stood for 47 years, outlasting Margaret herself by nearly a decade. She died in 1914, at the age of 71, in the same cabin where she had survived the avalanche of 1880. Her obituary in the Georgetown Courier mentioned that she had been a well-known figure in the high country, consulted by many settlers on matters of homestead location and construction. It did not mention the avalanche. It did not mention her father's notebook or the deflection wedge or the bermed construction that had kept her alive when the mountain decided to remind everyone that it could kill them whenever it chose. By 1914, the techniques she had introduced to the district had become so commonplace that no one remembered they had ever been unusual. New cabins in avalanche-prone terrain were routinely positioned behind natural barriers, oriented to deflect rather than resist, built with an understanding of terrain that would have seemed obvious to any sensible person, except that sensible people had not built that way until a Swiss widow showed them why they should. The cabin was finally destroyed by a fire in 1923, 9 years after Margaret's death. The property had passed through several owners by then, none of whom had the same understanding of maintenance and vigilance that Margaret had brought to her structure. A chimney fire in December of that year spread to the roof timbers before anyone could respond, and by morning, nothing remained except the granite face of the mountainside itself, blackened by smoke, but otherwise unchanged. The deflection wedge, rebuilt twice during Margaret's lifetime, and once by a subsequent owner, was left to collapse after the fire. The bermed foundation filled with debris and was eventually reclaimed by the slope. Today, the site is marked only by a slight depression in the terrain and a few rusted iron straps that once reinforced the wedge structure, artifacts that hikers occasionally notice without understanding what they represent. The cabin that saved Margareta Brenner's life has vanished so completely that even locals who know the story cannot always locate the exact spot where it stood. But the principles she brought to that mountainside have not vanished. In modern avalanche engineering, the concepts Margaret applied in 1879, deflection structures, terrain positioning, earth-sheltered construction, are considered fundamental to building in avalanche-prone zones. The Swiss Federal Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research, established in 1936, has spent decades quantifying the physics that Margaret's father understood intuitively: the force vectors, the deflection angles, the relationship between structure geometry and survival probability. Their research has informed building codes throughout the Alps, the Rockies, the Andes, and every other mountain range where human beings insist on living in terrain that periodically tries to kill them. The mathematics have not changed since 1879. Only our ability to calculate them precisely has improved. In 2017, a team of engineers from the Colorado School of Mines conducted a retrospective study of historical avalanche events in Clear Creek County, using modern terrain modeling and snowpack analysis to reconstruct the probable paths and magnitudes of documented avalanches from the 19th century. Their reconstruction of the February 7, 1880, event confirmed what Margaret's survival had already demonstrated. The avalanche that struck her cabin carried sufficient force to destroy any conventional structure in its path. The fact that her cabin survived was not luck, it was design. The engineers noted that her deflection wedge, based on their calculations, reduced the effective impact force on her cabin walls by approximately 70%, enough to bring the load within the structural capacity of well-constructed log walls. The bermed construction provided additional lateral support that further reduced stress concentrations. And the positioning of the cabin, tucked against the granite face rather than exposed on the slope, minimized the accumulation zone and maximized the structure's ability to resist burial. These were not intuitive decisions. They were engineering decisions, made by a woman with no formal engineering training but with something equally valuable, a lifetime of observation in terrain that punished error with death. If this story has resonated with you, if you find value in learning about the forgotten innovations of people who never sought recognition, I would ask you to help spread this kind of knowledge. Share this video with someone who appreciates practical wisdom or historical accuracy. Leave a comment about the builders and problem solvers in your own family history, whose innovations were never formally recorded. The stories we preserve are the stories we choose to tell, and too often, we choose to tell the stories of people who achieved fame rather than people who achieved survival. Margareta Brenner never became famous. She never sought credit for her methods. She simply built what she knew to build and lived to see her decisions validated by the most unforgiving test possible. That should be enough to earn her a place in our collective memory. The final irony of Margareta Brenner's story is that her methods spread precisely because she did not insist on credit for them. The settlers who learned from her passed that knowledge to their children, who passed it to their neighbors, who carried it to new valleys and new mountain ranges across the West. By the time professional avalanche engineering emerged as a discipline in the 20th century, the folk knowledge that Margaret had brought from the Valais had been absorbed into the general understanding of mountain communities throughout the Rockies. No one cited her. No one built monuments to her. No one remembered that a Swiss widow had demonstrated these principles at nearly 11,000 feet in 1880. The knowledge simply became knowledge, the kind that everyone assumes has always existed because it seems so obvious in retrospect. That is the fate of practical innovation. It succeeds so completely that it becomes invisible. Margareta Brenner's surveyor's notebook, the one containing her father's drawings, was donated to the Colorado Historical Society in 1926 by a distant relative who had inherited it after her death. It sat uncatalogued in a storage facility for nearly 60 years, finally receiving attention in 1984 when a graduate student researching historic construction techniques stumbled upon it while looking for something else entirely. The student, whose name was Ellen Marchetti, recognized immediately what she had found: a primary source record of indigenous alpine construction knowledge translated to a new environment by someone who understood both the principles and the constraints. Marchetti's subsequent thesis, completed in 1986, remains the only academic treatment of Margareta Brenner's contributions to avalanche-resistant design in the Colorado High Country. It was read by perhaps 50 people. It changed nothing. The knowledge it documented continued to spread through practice rather than publication, as it had always spread, because knowledge that keeps you alive tends to propagate regardless of whether anyone writes it down. The spot where Margareta Brenner's cabin stood is now part of a national forest wilderness area, accessible only by trail during the summer months and completely impassable from November to May. The few hikers who reach the site each year see nothing remarkable: a slight depression in the mountainside, a few rusted metal fragments half buried in scree, the faint outline of what might once have been a cut channel in the granite face. They do not know that they are standing at the location of one of the most successful demonstrations of avalanche engineering in Colorado history. They do not know that a woman died within a mile of this spot because he built where he was told to build, while another woman survived because she built where she understood she needed to build. They do not know that the principles demonstrated on this mountainside in 1880 now inform building codes and safety standards across 3 continents. They see only a pretty view and a difficult trail, and the ever-present possibility of afternoon thunderstorms rolling over the divide. The mountain has long since reclaimed any evidence of human habitation. That is what mountains do. They erase the temporary interruptions of human presence and return to the state they occupied before we arrived. Margareta Brenner understood this better than most. She did not fight the mountain. She read it, respected it, and positioned herself where its forces would flow around her rather than through her. She built not a fortress, but a deflection, a way of being in the path of destruction without being destroyed by it. And when the destruction came, she survived, not through luck or faith or hope, but through mathematics. The cabin she built looked strange to everyone who saw it. The angle was wrong. The position was wrong. The wedge-shaped prow rising into the mountainside made no sense to people who had never seen an avalanche bury a village, but it was not strange. It was not wrong. It was precisely correct for the problem it was designed to solve, a problem that no one else in Clear Creek County believed existed until the night of February 7, 1880, when the mountain demonstrated that it had always been capable of exactly what Margaret knew it could do. She was ready. The mountain came. She survived. That's not luck talking. That's just physics.